Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Adams, An American Dynasty by Francis Russell. Read by Patrick Lawlor. 1. John Adams, the colonial lawyer. As the second President of the United States, John Adams, in his single term, has been overshadowed by both his predecessor and successor. Yet this chubby, opinionated New Englander, stubborn and egotistical, was truly a founding father, one of the few men without whom it would be impossible to imagine later America. George Washington, reserved and aloof even while president, became a symbol, a presence sufficient to chill the hand of anyone presumptuous enough to slap him on the back. The father of his country stood apart from ordinary people. Adams was all too obviously human, from his appearance to his tactlessly assertive manner, cranky, jealous, yet with a razor-sharp intellect and a keen awareness of his own weaknesses. An English diplomat considered him the most ungracious man he had ever encountered. Benjamin Franklin thought him always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, in some things, absolutely out of his senses. The three-branched system of American constitutional government, with its built-in system of checks and balances, owes more to him, perhaps, than to any other man. Though he was equally opposed by Thomas Jefferson's democratic and Alexander Hamilton's aristocratic extremists, he established governmental precedents at a time when it was questionable if the American experiment would survive. In later times, his views appear solider than Jefferson's fancies of the goodness of natural man, or Hamilton's feeling of the people as a great beast. The unprepossessing little man was more intelligent than Washington, and far more learned, more rational than Jefferson in regard to human nature, a political figure to whom his country would remain permanently indebted. In 1823, in the piety of his old age, Adams erected a monument in his native Quincy, Massachusetts, to his first American ancestor, Henry Adams, who in 1638 left Old England for the New. In the words of John, Henry's great-great-grandson, this obscure farmer took his flight from the dragon persecution. The inscription was more a sense of what ought to be than an established fact, as was the long pedigree produced by the next generation of Adamses to demonstrate their descent from an ancient Gloucestershire baronial family. Later and more professional genealogists would determine that the first American Adams was born in the little village of Barton St. David in Somerset, among the Polden Hills just 7 miles southeast of Glastonbury. His father and grandfather had farmed there, not as independent yeomen, but leaseholders, raising sheep and cattle and living in simple thatch-roofed stone cottages. Henry, the third-generation copyholder and founder of one of America's most durable dynasties, remains a dim figure, illuminated only briefly by a few lines in court and parish records. It is known that he was born about 1583, and that his people had lived in Barton St. David for over a century. At the age of 26, he married the 22-year-old Edith Squire, the daughter of the neighboring blacksmith, Charlton Mackerel. In the next 21 years, Edith bore her husband 9 surviving children, 8 boys and a girl, a surprising total in a day of high infant mortality. For some reason, the Adamses between 1614 and 1622 moved to the adjoining parish of King Weston. From there, Henry and Edith left England for America. Why they left, what they hoped for, or how they felt on turning their backs on the land of their inheritance remains supposition and conjecture. Like most emigrants, their motives were uncertain even to themselves, a mixture of piety and shrewdness, ambition and restlessness, resentment and hope. In the first half of the 17th century, English migration was an uneasy impulse, accentuated by hard times that brought soaring prices in lands and rents, and even more exacting taxes. Between 1620 and 1640, some 65,000 Englishmen sailed away to the West Indies or the American continent. Henry Adams may have been one of these restless men, unable to own land and eager to go where land was almost for the asking. There is no sign that the dragon persecution had troubled him in his remote village. For the most part, the parishioners of Barton St. David seemed unaffected by the waves of dissent. Marriages, baptisms, and funerals took place as they always had, in the accepted tradition under the curious octagonal tower of St. David's Church. But in adjoining Dorset, with Somerset and Devon a stronghold of Puritanism, the Reverend John White of Dorchester, a Puritan moderate remaining within the established church, had stirred many a yeoman and farmer to consider leaving the time-worn paths of his ancestors. In 1623, White organized the Dorchester Adventurers to aid both nonconformists and loyal churchmen in the settling of New England. In 1628, the adventurers were absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Company, which secured a liberal charter for its colonists. From 1629 to 1640, about 25,000 Englishmen, mostly so-called Puritans, left their homeland for New England. Among the early migrants was Edith Adams's younger sister Anne, married to Aquila Purchas, a master of Trinity School in Dorchester, who sailed from England in 1633. Aquila either died on the voyage or shortly afterward. His widow remained in New England after being granted 4 acres of land in the New Dorchester, and in 1637 she married a widower, Thomas Oliver of Boston. 5 years after the Purchases, the Adamses finally sailed. With them were 8 of their 9 children. Their sons Henry, Thomas, Samuel, Peter, John, Joseph, and Edward, and their one daughter Ursula. Their 3rd son, Jonathan, would remain behind for another 12 years. Accompanying them on the voyage was Margaret Shepherd, another of Edith's 4 sisters, with her husband, John. As the head of a family of 10 with payment of 3 shillings an acre, Henry was granted 40 acres at Mount Wollaston, 6 miles south of Boston, where Royalist Thomas Morton had founded his Puritan-defying Merrymount a decade before. In 1640, Mount Wollaston became part of Braintree, later Quincy. By the time Henry received his acres, the land had been cleared, the first roads laid out, a school set up, and a first church had been established. More influential Mount Wollaston settlers, like Edmund Quincy and William Hutchinson, the husband of the heretical Anne, were granted as much as 500 acres each by the Massachusetts legislature. Henry Adams was content with his 40. He lived a mere 8 years after setting foot on American soil, farming his acres, brewing beer in a shed next to his house, caring for his children, and acquiring a respectable minimum of possessions. When he died in October 1646 at the age of 63, an inventory of his estate valued his property at £75. This included a 2-room house with a barn, 3 beds, 2 chests, some old books, pewter plates, a silver spoon, a skillet, a spit and trivet and gridiron, a warming pan, tools, lumber, a cow and heifer, pigs, and corn. The books, it was out of the ordinary for a New England farmer to own more than the Bible, were to be divided among his children. His house and other possessions went to his wife, so long as she liveth unmarried. When 5 years later Edith wed John Fussell of adjoining Weymouth, the house reverted to Ursula and the two youngest sons, Joseph and Edward. Through some private agreement, Joseph secured his father's farm. There he lived out the rest of his life, the sole Adams to stay in Quincy. The second Henry Adams, one of the founders of Medfield, Massachusetts, was joined there by his remarried mother and his brothers Peter and Edward. Jonathan, when he finally came over from England in 1651, also settled in Medfield. Most of the village went up in flames in 1676 when the Indians raided it in King Philip's War. During the attack, Henry was killed on his own doorstep. Thomas moved to Concord, then became one of the founders of Chelmsford, where he was followed by John, who erected a mill there. Ursula, 4 times widowed, lived respectively in Charlestown, Watertown, Dorchester, and Roxbury. The names of 7 of the 9 Adams children were to prove as ephemeral as those of their fellow voyagers, persisting on slate gravestones, if at all. Only John and Joseph fathered enduring Adams lines. On his arrival in America, John was apprenticed to a Cambridge millwright, and after serving his 7 years, continued in that trade. The businessman of the family, his affairs took him to England in 1650. Returning the following year with his brother Jonathan, he settled in the monotony section of Cambridge, where his descendants remained until the next century, when they moved to New Hampshire. In the latter part of the 19th century, these farming Adamses evolved into traders and financiers, allied and related to the Morgans, and as Episcopalian church wardens, who became stalwarts in the establishment their ancestor Henry had forsaken. Though it would not be evident for another 3 generations, the Adams blood that would make that family extraordinary in American history derived from Joseph, the 7th son. His own life passed as obscurely as that of his father. He farmed and occasionally brewed. He was respected for serving as a town selectman and surveyor of highways. The most noteworthy fact about him was that he had 12 children, 10 of whom survived infancy. Building on his father's modest means, he left an estate of nearly £350. The Adams historical line was passed on through Joseph's namesake and second son, and to a lesser extent through his 6th son John, a sea captain whose grandson Samuel would turn out to be a political power in Boston. The second Joseph passed his life in Quincy as a farmer and occasional maltster, a selectman, and briefly a constable. He married 3 times and had 11 children. His second wife, Hannah Bass, with whom he had 8 children, was the granddaughter of Deacon Samuel Bass, and also a descendant of John and Priscilla Alden, whose posthumous fame would have to wait on Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In marrying a deacon's daughter, Joseph had married up. His rise became manifest when he sent their first child, his first son, also a Joseph, to Harvard to become a clergyman, thus beginning the Adamses' long connection with the Puritan college. The middle Joseph died in 1737. Harvard, however, was not yet to provide the sequential background for the Adamses. The bearer of the family tradition, albeit unknowingly, was now the younger son, John. An industrious young man, he followed the shoemaker's trade in the winter months when he was not tilling the land. Several times he was chosen selectman. He became a lieutenant in a militia company commanded by Colonel John Quincy, and as a mark of his heightened importance in the rustic community, he was for many years deacon of the First Church. In 1720 he left the Adams homestead and bought the 4-room 2-story cottage of James Penniman with 6 acres of orchard and arable land near Penn's Hill in North Braintree. It wasn't until 1734, when he was 44, that he finally married. He chose as his bride 26-year-old Susanna Boylston of a Brookline family far more noted than his own. His son, John, was born a year after his marriage. Unlike the earlier prolific generations, Deacon John had only 3 children: John, Peter Boylston, and Elihu. In 1744 he bought the property adjoining his for £500. It had a house only a few yards from his own homestead, and was much like it in size and shape. With it went 9 1/2 acres. From this time on, the two places were known as the Penn's Hill Farm. He rented the second house to his niece, Anne, and her husband, Dr. Elisha Saville, leaving it in his will to his son, John. The homestead itself he left to Peter. When he died in 1761, his widow lived there until 1766, when she married a Lieutenant John Hall. In the century between Henry's arrival in Braintree and the birth of his great-great-grandson John, the Adams family followed the placid, plodding ways of their English forebears, respected and increasingly honored within the village, and scarcely known outside. Boston, though clearly visible from Penn's Hill, was as distant as London for the Adamses. They remained unconcerned by the turbulent growth of the provincial capital, the rise of a wealthy merchant class, the agitation against the Navigation Acts, the loss of the province's charter, the insurrection against Governor Edmund Andros, the fife and drum of recruiters summoning up volunteers for the wars against the French, and Boston's vice-regal aspect under the royal governors. On their Braintree farm they were content to follow Hesiod's ancient admonition, to plough and plant and set one's house in order, and nothing more. But with Deacon John's son and namesake, something transformed the placid Adams stock. Perhaps, as John Adams himself thought, it was the mixture of Boylston blood, or the age gap between father and mother, common among extraordinary children, or another inexplicable biological twist. With the birth of John in 1735, the history of the Adams family as a dynasty begins. 89 years after John's birth, his son, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, shortly to be president, after spending an autumn afternoon wandering among the tombstones of his ancestors in the Quincy graveyard, wrote in his diary, "4 generations of whom very little more is known than is recorded upon these stones. There are 3 succeeding generations of us now living. Pass another century, and we shall all be mouldering in the same dust, or resolved into the same elements. Who then of our posterity shall visit this yard? And what shall he read engraved upon the stones?" John Adams's mark of destiny was not apparent in his childhood. Small and sturdy, he was no early bookworm, but an outdoor boy who wandered with other boys across the familiar rolling and wooded countryside between Great Blue Hill and the sea. His closest friends were Edmund and Samuel Quincy, the sons of that great man of Braintree, Colonel John Quincy, and John Hancock, the minister's son. They played games, whittled toy boats, flew kites, rolled hoops, and explored the long marshes of the sinuous Neponset River. The town brook ran through the Adams farm to the town landing, where the boys could see the scows arriving from Fore River, and they watched with awed curiosity the derelict survivors of the Ponkapoag tribe as they came each year to fish in the Neponset, so different from the legendary warriors of King Philip's War. Country boys learned to handle firearms early, and hunting soon became John's greatest joy. He tramped the woods with his fowling piece, picking off unwary squirrels, rabbits, and woodchucks, and even the wary crow by imitating its caw. As he grew more skilled, he shot quail, woodcock, and wild turkey. In a scow concealed by reeds, he lay in wait in the Neponset marshes for the ducks and geese as they flew south. Later he admitted that shooting gave him a delight that he never felt for any other business, study, or amusement. 3 years before his birth, the inhabitants of Braintree had taxed themselves, both literally and figuratively, by building a new meeting house. Deacon Adams's pew, placed prominently just to the left of the pulpit, demonstrated his position in the church and the community. Calvinism remained far more rigid in the villages than in the towns. Church services absorbed most of Sunday mornings and afternoons, with services and sermons of traditionally interminable length. The boys sat in the gallery where they whispered and shuffled until the tithing man brought them to order. The older ones, from that vantage point, cast covert eyes at the girls in their Sunday best. From the age of 10, John sensed the charm of burgeoning young ladies. In his adolescence, his bright good looks attracted girls even as he was attracted to them. As he admitted in his autobiography, he was of an amorous disposition. Yet he was always able to keep his disposition under control. However he may have felt in his hot youth, in the dying embers of his old age he was glad he had restrained his natural temperament, and he found it consolatory beyond all expression that he had not given in to the varieties of libertinism available in rural Braintree. He first attended the one-room school for the Braintree children of all ages, run by Dame Belcher in the stern tradition of the New England primer. As one of the brightest boys, he became the teacher's early favorite. From there he entered the local Latin school, a staple of most Puritan-derived communities, as the first step toward college and the clergy. Again the boy found himself in a one-room school, run this time by one Joseph Cleverly, whose name belied the fact that he was a failed schoolmaster, an uninspired, uninspiring Harvard graduate come down in the world. For an impatient country boy who saw himself as just one more in a line of farmers, school was a bore, and the study of Latin the most onerous of tasks. Only mathematics struck his fancy. John showed no early love of books or learning, and he grew to hate school. Nevertheless, Deacon Adams was determined to send his eldest boy to Harvard, and, if possible, make a clergyman of him. What, then, the exasperated deacon asked in one heart-to-heart talk, did his son want to be? "A farmer," the boy replied to his dismayed parent. The next morning, as a practical demonstration of what it meant to be a farmer, the deacon took his son to Penny Ferry, where they spent a sweltering day in swamp muck, tormented by flies and mosquitoes, cutting reeds for thatch. That evening the father asked his son if he was satisfied with being a farmer. "I like it very well, sir," the boy replied. "Aye, but I don't like it so well," was his father's irritated retort. "So you shall go to school today." Stubbornly, the boy insisted that he preferred creek thatch to education. Long afterward, he recalled the scene in his autobiography. "You know," said my father, "I have set my heart upon your education at college, and why will you not comply with my desire? Sir, I don't like my schoolmaster. He is so negligent and so cross that I can never learn anything under him. If you will be so good as to persuade Mr. Marsh to take me, I will apply myself to my studies as closely as my nature will admit, and go to college as soon as I can be prepared." Next morning the first I heard was, "John, I have persuaded Mr. Marsh to take you, and you must go to school there today." This Mr. Marsh was a son of our former minister of that name, who kept a private boarding school, but 2 doors from my father's. To this school I went, where I was kindly treated, and I began to study in earnest." Before then, John had often played truant, hiding in the marshes with his fowling piece to shoot ducks and geese. Now he exchanged the fowling piece for books, and in a little over a year he was ready for the examination of candidates for admission to Harvard. On an overcast morning in the late summer of 1750, he rode to Cambridge. Terrified at the thought of introducing myself to such great men as the president and fellows of a college, he recalled, I at first resolved to return home. But foreseeing the grief of my father, and apprehending he would not only be offended with me, but my master too, whom I sincerely loved, I aroused myself and collected resolution enough to proceed. In his boyish awkwardness he now had to face President Holyoke and the Harvard tutors, sternly aloof in the formality of their gowns and wigs. After a few preliminary questions, one of the tutors, Joseph Mayhew, a plump, amiable man, handed the boy a page of English to translate into Latin. One glance told Adams it was beyond his thin knowledge, and he was overcome with a sinking sense of failure. Noting his dismay, the good-natured Mayhew called him to his study and said encouragingly, "There, child, is a dictionary, there a grammar, and there paper, pen, and ink, and you may take your own time." Fortified by the tools so gratuitously provided, Adams sat down at the desk with revived confidence. The Latin was soon made, I was declared admitted, and a theme given me to write on in the vacation. I was as light when I came home as I had been heavy when I went. My master was well pleased, and my parents very happy. I spent the vacation not very profitably, chiefly in reading magazines. A few weeks later, young Adams left Braintree for Cambridge in a much more buoyant frame of mind as a Harvard freshman. The college under President Holyoke, like Massachusetts itself in the mid-18th century, had been breaking away from the earlier rigidities of Calvinism. Though himself a clergyman, Holyoke was a religious liberal, firm in his faith as a clergyman, yet tolerant for his time, one of Harvard's notable reformist presidents. Harvard in its second century was no longer a forcing house for congregational ministers. Holyoke enlarged the Puritan college's horizons and softened its doctrinal rigidities. For both president and tutors, the truths of the Christian religion stood beyond doubt, but Harvard students were inducted into the body of ancient and modern knowledge that educated men were expected to absorb. To those who came later, the College of Adams's time would seem rigid enough. All students followed the same course. Freshmen studied Greek and Latin, logic, rhetoric, and physics. Sophomores continued this curriculum, except they replaced physics with natural philosophy, as science was then called. Junior sophisters added metaphysics and geography, while seniors, besides reviewing their previous studies, undertook mathematics and philosophy. The day opened at 6 o'clock with prayers. Breakfast followed, a meager parceling of bread, biscuit, and milk, and classes began at 8 with a lecture. The rest of the morning was devoted to study and recitations in the subject of the lecture. Lunch was at noon, followed by more study and recitations. Evening prayers were at 5 and supper at 7:30. From then until 9, students were free to do as they pleased. Saturday was devoted to the study of theology under President Holyoke. Church attendance on Sunday was, of course, compulsory. Removed from their ancestral pieties, a medieval license prevailed among the Cambridge students, in spite of the efforts of tutors and president to control it. Undergraduates were repeatedly disciplined for abominable lasciviousness, for firing off pistols, skating on the Charles without permission, cutting up at prayers, and profaning the Sabbath. In short, like students elsewhere, they caroused and chased women and drank. Drunken students even rolled.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?